All right, so I want to start off by saying thank you for taking some time to share a little bit of your afternoon with me today. My name is Janelle Ware, and I am the horticulture educator with UW-Madison Extension for the Wood and Marathon counties. So today we are going to talk about managing weeds in the garden, and I am going to go ahead and get my screen up. That way we can jump right in. Bear with me while it loads. There we go. All right, so I've got a lot that I want to cover with you today. We're going to start off with just identifying what are we talking about when we say weeds? What are weeds and what are characteristics of weedy plants? Then we're going to go into why, is weed management necessary? Why is it? We'll talk a little bit about the different types of weeds, but don't worry, this isn't going to be a long dive into identifying all the different types of plants there are in Wisconsin. It's just going to be a really nice, easy categories for thinking about different types of plants in terms of how we can use these categories with our weed management. And then we're going to talk into different control methods. So we'll start first with cultural methods. We'll move into mechanical methods, chemical methods, and then finally, chemical methods. And then finally, what to do when you need to triage, when you've gone on vacation and came back and the garden has gotten out of control. Where do we start then? So why don't we start off with just talking about what is a weed? So go ahead and just drop in the chat how you would define a weed. And I see Connie has already answered with something not edible and or out of place, crowding out more desirable plants. I like that one. I like that one. Anything growing where it isn't wanted. We've got a plant that I do not want in my garden. A plant growing in the wrong place. A plant that I don't want in that area. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the same themes here. I want to back up a little bit though to one of the answers. Something that's not edible, that's not necessarily true. Purslane is a pretty common weed, and it's certainly an edible plant. So just something to kind of think about. They don't always have to be edible or not edible, but generally speaking, we're talking about plants that are growing someplace where we don't want them to grow, right? And so characteristics of those weedy plants are going to be, they're going to grow very quickly. They're going to be opportunistic. They're going to produce abundant, long-lived seeds. Okay. And then another one is, and this isn't always true, but you'll find this pretty often, they reproduce vegetatively. So they might produce runners. Think of like quackgrass or creeping Charlie. That's part of the reason why they're so difficult to get rid of. Okay. So next, let's talk about why weed management is necessary. What are we even here for? Why do we need to go through all this trouble? So I just launched a poll. Go ahead and read through the questions, or read the question is, why is weed management necessary? Go ahead and read through all of those answers and then just select the one that you think is the best answer. And then we'll talk about it when we're all through. I see those answers are popcorning in. Are about 61% done. We'll give it a few more moments. I'm going to give this about 10 more seconds and then we'll finish up. All right, so let's kind of go through all of those answers real briefly. So we had weedy plants tend to be well adapted to most sites, and that's definitely going to be true. Weedy plants compete for resources like sunlight, moisture, and nutrients. Yeah, that's the biggest one. We don't want, competition for resources is what the main game is all about, right? That's what plants are doing. And so, if the weed plants are competing for nutrients or maybe sunlight, if they're growing taller than the plants that we want to grow and they're shading them out, then our plants aren't going to thrive the way that they should. Weedy plants can harbor pests and diseases. And so this is something often diseases are specific to plant families. And so if you've got a plant that's in a family, a weed that's in a plant family nearby, that's the same family as something that you're trying to grow, you may find that getting rid of those other weeds in the area might reduce your disease or your pest pressures. And then I've got weedy plants are hardy and can overwinter for years. And then when you work that soil, the seeds are brought up to the surface waiting to germinate. So this becomes a trouble, especially like if we're thinking about vegetable gardens. Perennial gardens, not so much because we don't go in and rework that soil over and over again. We plant and then we're kind of good for a while. Vegetable gardens, year after year, we're in there working that soil and we're bringing seeds up, weed seeds up, and they germinate and causing problems for us. And those seeds can stay dormant for very long periods of time. That's part of the reason why weeds can be such a nuisance. It's difficult to get rid of them. You can't just get rid of them one year and think that they're going to be gone for good. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and just talk about weed categories. So, and the reason why is we want to identify those weeds because if we identify the weeds, we can get some um, important information about their life cycle, and that might help us when it comes time to how making choices of how we're going to manage these weeds. So first of all, once you've identified the weed, you're going to figure out whether or not it's an annual or perennial. And so just making sure that we're working with the same definitions here. Annuals are plants. And again, not necessarily weeds. This is in the whole world of plants. Annuals are plants that complete their life cycle in a single growing season. So they'll germinate, the seeds will germinate when the conditions are favorable. But here's the thing to keep in mind. Favorable conditions are going to be species specific, meaning that, in early spring, the conditions when, it might be a little bit cool, yet and a little bit wet, yet those conditions might be favorable to certain types of plants, but not favorable to other types of plants. You may find later on in the season, as the soil warms up, it is more favorable to certain types of plants. And then, yes, less favorable to other types of plants. So keep that in mind. Favorable conditions are favorable to the plant. Okay. So because of that, dormant seeds can persist in the soil for very long periods of times, years, just because a plant produces a flower, the flower is pollinated, and then it produces a seed. That doesn't necessarily mean that that seed is going to germinate that year. It may be several years for that seed to germinate. So in the picture here on the left-hand side, I've got a picture of pineapple weed. On the right-hand side, I've got a perennial weed. So perennials in general, they live for 3 or more years, okay? They grow many years from the same root system. All right. And that's how they're able to generate year after year. That root system stays alive even if the surface dies back. They may or they may not flower that first year or first couple of years. And again, vegetative reproduction is common, so production by some sort of runners. Here I've got a picture of quackgrass, and you can see, if you look closely in the picture, you can see where it's going to be growing off of the runner. And that's how they tend to become so problematic. Another way that we can categorize plants is by monocots and dicots, okay? So let's think back to if you've ever started a plant from a seed. So vegetable seeds, if you've ever started them, either indoors or outdoors, but if you've ever witnessed a seed germinating and then starting to grow, what you'll notice is there'll usually be two little sets of leaves, right? And then after that will be another set of leaves that will grow. And I'm saying sets of leaves because generally speaking, when we start seeds, it's either vegetables or flowers, and most of those are going to be dicots, meaning that they've got two sets of that first leaves that come out. Now, those first leaves that we see, those we call cotyledons, okay? And you'll notice if you start seeds, you'll hear in books or people talk about, start fertilizing after so many sets of true leaves. True leaves are the leaves that come out afterwards, okay? And so monocots and dicots, they're divided by how many cotyledons, or those first leaves, come out. With dicots, you'll have two. With monocots, you'll have a single one, all right? So your dicots, or I'm sorry, your monocots, again, the single cotyledons, they tend to have very long, narrow leaves, grassy. They tend to be what we call grassy, or maybe grassy grass types of plants. Um, the veins in the leaves will have a parallel structure to them, and they tend to have very fibrous roots, and their flower parts will be in threes. That's generally, though. All right. So in the picture over here, I've got a picture of crabgrass, and that's an annual, by the way. So again, your monocots and your dicots can come as annuals or perennials. So in that last picture, the grassy plant, this was a perennial. That's quackgrass. And here I've got an annual. This is crabgrass. And then moving over to dicots, so those are going to be your plants that have the two sets of leaves when they first start, two cotyledons. They get wide leaves. That's why often on herbicide packaging, you'll hear them referred to as broadleaf plants or broadleaf weeds. They've got veins that radiate from the midrib, and then they could have a taproot or fibrous roots, either way. And their flower parts tend to come in fours or fives. So here in the picture, does anybody go ahead and drop it in the chat? Does anybody know who this infamous weed often goes into our lawns? Any ideas? Anybody know who that is? You can just put it in the chat. No? Creeping Charlie. Donna got it. Yep, Donna and Ann got it. Creeping Charlie. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about why weed management is so important, and we've talked a little bit about how we can kind of think about categorize different types of plants, weedy plants especially, into annuals and perennials, and into monocots and dicots, or grassy plants and broadleaf plants. Now we're going to switch over and think about control methods that we can use. And I want us to always kind of keep in mind control methods in a hierarchy, okay? So we don't want to just go first thing we see a weed. We're not just going to jump right to the top of this pyramid here and grab our bottle of herbicide. It's important that we really utilize these bottom layers first before we get up into the chemical, okay? So you want to start with the bottom up. So your cultural methods are going to be things like basically anything that you're doing to grow your plants that discourages competition from the weeds. That's going to include things like proper plant spacing, keeping your plants healthy, anything in the category of keeping your plants healthy, because healthy plants are going to be less susceptible to the pressures of competition for resources. We want to make sure, mulching is in our toolbox. And then also keep in mind, cultural methods work really, really well when we're dealing with annual weeds. Okay. Then moving up the pyramid, getting into those mechanical methods, that's going to be using our hands, either with tools and cultivation or just getting out there, hands and knees and hand pulling those weeds. And then finally, those chemical methods, those are going to be utilizing herbicides. And remember, organics are going to be in that chemical up there. So even if you're using horticulture oil, you don't want that to be your first choice. Okay. You want to implement all of the tools in the weed management toolbox. So your chemical methods should always be a last resort. Okay, so let's take a deep dive into the cultural methods. It's going to be things like I said. Well, what we're going to talk about today is mulches, water management, intensive planting, cover crops, and then transplants. But remember, cultural really includes anything that you're doing to keep your plants growing healthy. Okay, so let's talk about mulches, and specifically organic mulches. So when I'm thinking of organic mulches, I'm just thinking of something that I can use as a mulch that is derived from natural from something a natural source. Okay, so I don't necessarily mean that if I want to use straw, I'm not meaning straw that's grown on an organic farm. It's certified organic. I just mean that it's derived from natural sources. So does anybody have a possible what's a possible organic mulch? Go ahead and drop that inside the chat. Dried grass clippings. That's a fantastic one. Great way to reuse something like something that would be waste in the lawn. Shredded leaves, again, kind of, recycling that resource. Wood chips, shredded wood, dry glass clippings, manure, wood chips. About compost. Yep. Straw, any of those things can be used as a mulch, right? How about what is a benefit of using organic mulches? Why would we want to use organic mulches that are derived from natural sources? Yeah. So Keith says that it's adding to the soil, it's adding organic matter to the soil. And whether you have super heavy clay soil or if you've got really sandy soils, adding organic matter is going to help either one of them. Breaks down to feed the soil organisms. That's a great answer, Donna. I love that. Yep. Yeah, you're making so we need to think of our soil as being a dynamic ecosystem with lots of different types of micro and macro organisms. And when we're adding organic material to the soil, it's helping that. We'll break down and add organisms to the soil. Absolutely. I've got one more for you though. How about it loosens the soil and that'll make it easier to pull the weeds. Margaret's adding it helps retain moisture and helps keep the soil temperature more stable. Yep, that's a great one too. hmm so let's see. The way that you want to apply an organic mulch is start off with a cardboard or several sheets of newspaper as your base layer, and then top it with 2 to 3 inches of whatever this resource that you're using, whether it's uh, grass clippings, compost, any of those materials that you happen to have on hand. Okay, so now let's talk about plastic mulch. Plastic, you want to stick with a black plastic mulch. Clear plastic's not going to stop the weed growth. It will get hot underneath there, but not hot enough to stop seeds from germinating. So there's two different ways that you're going to think about using a black plastic mulch. One would be just to use it to clear out a brand new bed. So it's going to kill everything underneath the bed, or you could use it with transplants. So in this picture, I've got they're starting onions with the black mulch. Um, you can you could either use it with the transplants like this, but if you are using it with the transplants and you plan to grow things and not just use it as to smother the weeds, then you want to make sure that the holes are large enough for water to get to the plants. Okay, and then if you plan on installing drip or soaker hosers, sorry, drip or soaker hoses, make sure that you install those before you get the plastic put into place. Seems kind of intuitive, but it's one of those things that it's a mistake you only make once, right? And then make sure, or also you can use landscape fabric. It's going to be the use is going to be real similar to plastic, except for landscape fabric will also let some of the moisture go through. Okay, so now we're going to be thinking about this not in our general gardening lens, but but through the lens of weed management. Okay, so we're thinking about watering our plants. Which is better, using an overhead sprinkler or using drip irrigation if we want to manage weeds? By managing weeds, I mean avoid them. Um, what, which one is better? Go ahead and put it in the chat which one you think. And then if you know why, even better. Overhead sprinklers or drip irrigation? Water that kind of goes everywhere, or very, very directed water? Okay, so Margaret says drip is better because it's more targeted and water is at the ground and doesn't invite disease. Drip. Less evaporation and waste with the water. So yes, with the less evaporation. So drip is the right answer. Drip or soaker hosers is the right answer, and it is because it's very, very targeted where the water is going. Um, and here, yes, it's completely true that you're not wasting as much water, but from a weed management standpoint, that's not the thing that I'm really focusing on. I'm more focused on all of the places where water lands that the plant isn't going to make use of. That is potentially a place where a weed seed will germinate. If you're watering bare soil, you're inviting seeds to germinate. And so if you're really directing that water to only where your plants are, then you've got less chance of seeds germinating in random places where you don't want them to be. Okay. Oh, and then just to back up here too, the other method of watering that I didn't have in this picture would be just going around either with a hose and a watering wand or watering cans. And again, with those, you can be very, very directed and intentional of where that water goes. Okay, so next I want to talk about using intensive planting as a weed management tool. So intensive planting is fantastic because you can get a greater yield out of a smaller space, but it also helps with our weeds too. So it's kind of like an added bonus. So what do I mean by intensive planting? I mean planting plants close together and being very intentional and kind of thinking about how you're planting your different plants. So in this picture, I've got some lettuce plants that are interplanted with onions. The lettuce will be finished before the onions are ready to be harvested. And so that's an example of intensive planting. So anybody have an idea of what the benefit is of as far as Now, specifically with the lens of weed management, what is the benefit of intensive planting? How are we avoiding weeds here? Any thoughts? Great thoughts. Fantastic. So let me scroll back up and get here. Let's see. So we've got no light, crowd out, weed use of resources, less space and nutrients for the weeds. Um, plants shade Plants shade the soil to prevent germination, not much room to grow. Yeah, so it's actually, we're taking that competition for resources and flipping it on its head, right? Yeah, the weeds can't compete now because the plants that we want, the plants we're taking care of, are taking up all the space and using up all those resources. Okay, so what's the challenge here? What, from a weed management standpoint, why is this what makes what part of this makes weed management more difficult? Insects? Well, insects could definitely uh come in. It's really easy to see in this picture where the onions are and where the lettuce is, right? Can you see if there's any seed or any weeds? And especially let's like kind of look over at these plants too. Can we see if there's any weeds started underneath those plants? Yeah, Donna and Sue got where I'm going with this. Harder to find the weeds and harder to get rid of the weeds. Yep, both of those. Both of those. So it's going to be more difficult to find those weeds, and then pulling those weeds, you're going to have to get down on your hands and knees or get down. You're going to have to hand pull them. It's a lot more difficult to get in there with a cultivator of any sort. Get in there with your tools or like a hoe and get in there because you don't want to accidentally yank out the plants that you're trying to grow, right? Okay. How about cover crops? For weed management, again, I'm using that lens of weed management. There's lots and lots of fantastic reasons why we would want to utilize cover crops, but how do cover crops help us out in weed management? Shades them out. That's what Keith shared. Yeah, there isn't any room for the weeds. Yeah, we took up all the bare soil. We took up all the bare soil. And in fact, when we're growing cover crops, we're not too worried about, a yield from it, right? So we can really intensively plant and put the seed in there pretty close to definitely outcompete any of those weeds that are germinating. No room for the weeds. Yep. Couple other just want to throw it out there though, in case anybody's not familiar with cover crops or the other added benefits of utilizing cover crops. And basically, so cover crops, just to make sure we're all using the same definitions. Cover crops are just plants that you're growing in a bare soil garden, your garden space, while the garden space is sitting not in use. Okay. So, and there's lots of different things that you can use for cover crops. Oilseed radishes, I think, is one off the top of my head. Buckwheat's another one. If you've got questions about cover crops, you can definitely shoot me an email and I can give you some more information about them. But some other good things that they do in the garden is they prevent compaction and erosion, and they reduce disease and insect pressure. So definitely another good tool to keep. And then transplants. So transplants, kind of the same idea again. They since we've already started them early, either ourselves inside the house or inside of a cold frame, or we pick them up from the garden center. Either way, they're plants that are already started, so they've got a leg up against any seeds that are germinating. And then they're going to shade them out just like our cover crops will, or our intensive planting will. All right, so now we're going to switch gears. We just went over the bottom layer, and that's a really big umbrella. There's lots and lots of tools in the tool shed when we're thinking about cultural methods that we can do to avoid um, weed issues, competition of resources from weeds. Next, we're going to talk about mechanical. Here, at least when it comes with weed management, our tools are rather small. It basically comes down to hand pulling or cultivation, okay? And that's going to be using tools. There's always going to be some seeds that germinate, okay? So you want to make sure no matter how good you're keeping your garden, the seeds are going to germinate. What you will find though is if you're tending that garden year after year, the amount of weeds that you encounter, if you're really good at your weed management year after year, you're going to find that you're going to have less weeds because that seed bank is going to become smaller over time. One thing you want to keep in mind is weed when the soil is damp but not soggy, okay? So when the soil is really dry, it's very damaging to try to yank those weeds out. And then it's when the soil is dry, it's very difficult to pull the weeds out. When the soil is soggy, it's going to be damaging to the soil to pull the weeds out. So you want it to be moist but not soggy. And then keep in mind, weeds that are in the vegetable garden, especially a tended vegetable garden, once it's been established, you've been in that garden for a couple of years now, they're mostly going to be your annual weeds at that point, and annual weeds are best managed through either cultural or mechanical means. Okay, so we're going to kind of take a break for a moment and talk a little bit about our favorite gardening tools. I did this in a program, I think around this time last year, and I found that it was really useful because there's so many different gardening tools out on the market that I found that people really enjoyed learning a little bit about different types of tools out there. So I'm going to split us up into groups, small groups, just for a few minutes. Okay, so you should see breakout rooms are available. I think maybe we'll talk for about 4 minutes or so, and then I'll bring everybody back. So you should be able to see like a blue button that says join breakout room. And for some reason, if you're not able to join a breakout room, that's no problem. You can hang out with me too. All right, so for those of us left, does anybody have a favorite gardening tool? I know Cobra Head is a real popular one. It's a small handheld cultivator. It's got a long hook to it. I know a lot of people that really like that one a lot. I'm just writing down what time it is so that way we can come back. I'm trying to think of any. I know at the Master Gardener, the Marathon County Master Gardener Garden Visions last winter, the keynote speaker talked about a Dutch hoe that he was really singing the praises about. And I think it has a longer handle than normal hose, and so it's easier. And I think that you're supposed to be using more of a forward action with it, so it's supposed to be easier to utilize. So, a lot of different interesting tools out on the market. All right, so everybody's jumping back. I'll wait for everybody to get back, and just wondering, did anybody learn about a new tool that you didn't know about, or does anybody have a tool that you're like, hey, this is the greatest thing out there and every gardener needs to know about this? And feel free, if you'd like, go ahead and unmute yourself while we're sharing. Let everybody bounce back. Did anybody have a tool that you learned about that was like, wow, I didn't even know that was out there. I'm gonna have to look for that. Or does anybody have a tool that you found that you think every gardener needs to know about? Anne mentions the cobra head. Japanese hoe. Huh. I'm gonna have to go look that one up. Yeah, the cobra head is very real popular with a lot of people. It's got a long hook to it. Keith said he had to go look up the Japanese hoe too. After we're all finished today, I'm gonna have to go check that out and see what that's about. All right. Well, hopefully everybody learned a little something. Otherwise, we're gonna keep on going. Let me just close that. Okay. So now we're going to go into the chemical methods, the chemical control methods. And what I want to talk about here is pre and post emergent and selective and non-selective. So these are categories, much like I talked about before with the categories of plants in terms of perennial and annual, and monocots and dicots, especially the monocots and dicots. This is where that information is going to come into play. Okay. So pre and post emergent, these are just categories of chemicals, selective and non-selective, another way that we can categorize different types of chemicals. So before we go any further, when we're talking about chemical controls, we're talking about both organic and synthetics, okay? So we want to keep, no matter how the chemical is derived. And when we're talking about organic versus synthetic, those are, all we're talking about is the materials that the chemical is derived from. Okay, so organics are chemicals, synthetics are chemicals. They're both chemicals. Organics are just derived from natural sources. So they might be derived from, say, botanicals like pyrethrum or neem, or they might be derived from a synthetic source, meaning that it was created inside of a lab. Chemical controls, and both organic and synthetics can have different degrees of toxicity. So just because it's organic doesn't mean that it's not toxic or it couldn't be harmful to either humans or the environment. So keep in mind, we're still talking about chemicals, okay? Chemical controls should always, 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 always be utilized as a last resort after applying the cultural and mechanical methods, okay? Most weeds inside vegetable gardens can be managed through either those chemical or those mechanical means. However, there are going to be times that you may find that situation says that we need to use something, we need to use a chemical control method. And so when those occasions arise, make sure that you're following the directions on the label, okay? So Let's talk a little bit about pre-emergent versus post-emergent pesticides. So obviously these are made up labels. I made these labels. The one on the left-hand side is a pre-emergent, where the one on the right-hand side we would consider a post-emergent. So pre-emergent herbicides, they prevent seeds from germinating, okay? They won't work on a bona fide plant that has roots and leaves. If it has already germinated, then the pre-emergent's not going to work on that, okay? Now, where this can be really helpful is in places where you've got annual weed seeds. They are very, very effective with annual weeds. That's why a lot of times you'll see a crabgrass preventer in a weed and feed. At that crabgrass preventer, that's a pre-emergent herbicide. That's just making sure that the seeds aren't germinating. Just double checking my notes. Oh, keep in mind though, so it's not selective. It doesn't know your radish seed from your crabgrass seed. Okay, so if you're using it inside of a vegetable garden, it's going to prevent all seeds from germinating, including the seeds that you want. So might not a vegetable garden may not be the best use for a pre-emergent herbicide. On the other hand, post-emergent herbicides are going to work after that plant has germinated. And so they are effective on both annual and perennial weeds. Now here, we're going to talk about selective versus non-selective herbicides, okay? Selective herbicides are herbicides that they're selective. They're only effective on certain groups of plants, okay? And oftentimes that group is either going to be a monocot or a dicot. It's either going to be grassy plants or it's going to be broadleaf plants, okay? So you'll notice I've got Chemco Inc. Grassy Weed Killer. Great for strawberries and asparagus beds. When we think about it, strawberries and asparagus, those are broadleaf plants. This is going to kill anything grassy, so you can use it in those beds, okay? On the other hand, I've got mustard, grass, and broadleaf killer. Basically, the active ingredient in our mustard is going to, it's going to kill all plants. It's not selective. It doesn't care if you're a monocot or a dicot. It will kill plant tissue, all types of plant tissue that it comes into contact with, okay? So these are going to be key things if you do decide that you need to employ chemical controls after you've done the cultural and mechanical efforts. These might be helpful things to kind of keep in mind when you're choosing what type of herbicide would be best for your situation. All right, finishing up. So you went on vacation and you came back and the vegetable garden is out of control. What to do? So one of my favorite quotes is the way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. Same thing with a garden that's become overrun with weeds. So you guys kind of be focused. Don't be overwhelmed by the entire garden. Start with anything that's going to seed, okay? You want to take care of that stuff because if it goes to seed and then releases the seeds into the garden, that's just adding to the seed bank that you're going to be fighting next year and subsequent years to come. So make sure that you're taking care of anything that's gone to seed first. The second thing you want to go after is those grasses or any invasive weeds, okay? And then finally, after you've taken care of those two, now it's time to kind of go back in and systematically take care of everything else. Okay? This at least gives us something to focus on and kind of break it up into smaller bites. We're not so overwhelmed by the whole picture. All right, so I'm wrapping us up a little early today. I've got a couple of things left for us. One is a demographics poll, and the second one is an evaluation poll. I'll talk about both of those shortly. Before I do, though, just curious if anybody has any takeaways from today's program, any aha moments where you were like, I didn't know about that, or that was really good to know. If you've got any of those, fantastic. You can either unmute yourself and share that with me, or go ahead and drop it inside the chat. Otherwise, anything that's clear as mud, what's still confusing? What can I help clarify? Drop any questions. You can either, again, unmute yourself, or you can drop them inside the chat. And in the meantime, I'm going to launch a couple of quick polls. The first one is a demographics poll. I'm employed by UW-Madison. UW-Madison Extension, and we are obligated by U.S. law to report our efforts in making sure that we're providing programming to everybody in our communities. And this is one of the ways that I report that information to my state and county partners. Couple of things to know. Number one, it's completely anonymous. I set this up so that way I would not be able to know who answered what, even if I wanted to. And number two, if you don't feel comfortable sharing this information with me, that's no problem. Prefer not to answer should be an option for each of the questions. And if you're having problems answering, there's a little gray bar on the right-hand side. Just scroll it all the way down to the bottom, and you'll find a submit button at the bottom there. I'm going to give everybody, looks like we're about halfway there. I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes to go over those demographics, and I'm going to take a look at the chat. Oh, okay. Oh, cool. We've got some, so Donna's gonna start mulching. Oh, Donna, so I just talked about the benefits of weed management. There's also soil moisture. You're gonna be able to control that. There's so much that you're gonna find with mulching that's gonna be beneficial. Keith says, no shortcut. Oop, where'd it go? There are no shortcuts, especially in flower beds. Yeah, definitely in flower beds. There's no silver bullet. But that's kind of the great thing about gardening. You got to get out there and put the effort in, and you got to be consistent. Teaches us it's a metaphor for life, right? All right. I'm going to give the demographics poll just probably about 10 more seconds, and then I'm going to switch this over. Sue says that she lost the Zoom during the favorite tools. Is there a list anywhere? There's not a list, but we came up with Cobra Head and Japanese hose were some new tools to people. And then Keith suggests that the mulch needs to be thick. Sue says that she has a number of creeping weeds this year that she's never seen before. Best way to get rid of them, I would start by IDing them. ID them, let's find out whether or not it's an annual or if it's a perennial, because if it's an annual, then you may just want to make sure that it doesn't go to seed. And that will be your best bet. If it's a perennial, then we may be needing to look at some different options depending on what it is. Bear with me right now. I'm switching gears and I'm launching an evaluation poll. It's just a couple quick questions to make sure this was a good use of your time as well as mine. I use this to report to my county, state, and I think maybe even national partners to share our efforts in extension. Creeping Charlie. So Creeping Charlie, there's two different, pulling them is not really going to be helpful. Culturally, what you could do, Creeping Charlie likes kind of moist, shady conditions. And so if you could do anything to open up the sunlight, get a little bit more sunlight in the area, that would be helpful. Of course, we don't want to cut down trees either though, right? So chemical options that you may want to consider would be something that would be good for broadleaf. The names of the chemicals are escaping me, but if you want to email me, you can. They're the typical broadleaf weed herbicides that you're going to use. The timing for
creeping Charlie. That's the magic. That's where it happens. So you can either use your chemical sprays that are rated for creeping Charlie, either when it's in flower or in the fall. And by in the fall, I mean like start using it mid-September. The reason why in the fall is such a great time is because plants are doing what they call translocation, meaning that they're getting ready to be able to survive over the winter time. And so they are taking all of their nutrients and taking them down to the roots. And we can take advantage of this translocation by giving the weed a herbicide, and it's got a better chance of penetrating all the way down to the roots and actually killing the weed once and for all. So that would be my thought as far as creeping Charlie goes. Oh, and Donna's asking, are there any weeds that are better controlled in the spring or in the fall? Perennial, you'll find. So creeping Charlie is, I was talking about creeping Charlie just now, but yeah, in general, you'll find that fall is often a better time to try to manage perennial weeds, a lot of your perennial weeds. And it's because if we're using chemical controls, we can take advantage of that translocation action. All right, I'm going to end polling for that. Thank you so much for sharing that information with me. So it'll help me in reporting my efforts. Just want to double track here. Okay, well, I think I got through all of the chat. And we are finishing out a little bit early. If anybody's got any other questions for me, I'm going to stick around for a couple of moments. Otherwise, or if later on you think about it, 2 o'clock in the morning, oh, there's that question I needed to have the answer to. You've got my email address, so feel free to shoot me an email. All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with me this afternoon. And if you've got any questions going forward, feel free to reach out. Take care.